First, I would like to thank Dee and Greg for inviting and helping me out. It always feels good to be in this place. And I would say too that without having really explained to Greg what I was talking about other than the title, his choices have been very succinct, as well as the reading of the Lorax, which we'll see as the story goes. So whether that's synchronicity or kismet or magic, I do appreciate it. And because this is a Unitarian church, and because the topic is historical, I should take a moment before we begin to go over some terms and conditions, amen. Please be advised, this story may contain missing information, misinformation, and misunderstandings. Biases may include, but are not limited to, confirmation, selection, cultural, political, ethnocentric, gendered, temporal, and historical. Listeners wishing to engage in historical analysis of any kind should keep an open mind taken with a healthy dose of skepticism. My historical narrative should not be considered a substitute for the listener's own critical thinking and/or common sense, and should only be taken as part of a healthy research diet high in primary sources. Now that's out of the way, I can continue with the story. And although I won't be able to tell the whole story in the same way history can't ever tell the whole story, pieces, fragments, and ideas are all we really have to work with. So this story will be missing details, and it's the details that I find fascinating, beautiful, poetic, and tragic. Since this isn't a Quentin Tarantino movie, I'm going to start the story at the beginning, not in the middle, but it will jump around a lot. In some ways, this is a story that has no end, more like a spiral or a spider web than a straight line from A to B. But it starts in Africa. Once upon a time, long, long ago, in a place far, far away that might as well have been another galaxy, there were the first humans. Who were they? Where did they come from? That's a story for a different time. But we do know the first humans were from Africa, and some experts believe their names were Adam and Eve. Now here's where the story gets interesting. The humans started to multiply and expand their habitat to every corner of the globe. And the last step of a migration that took thousands of years was onto the island of Rapa Nui. How many have heard of Rapa Nui? And how many have heard of Easter Island? Already we've encountered one of the challenges of history. The name Easter Island originated from the day a Dutch explorer stumbled upon the island accidentally while searching for something else. Sound familiar? We'll spiral back around to that fateful Easter Sunday later, but for now, I'll use the name that the islanders themselves use, which is Rapa Nui. And before that, it was known as Te Pito Te Hanua, which translates to the navel of the world. Considered the most remote and isolated inhabited island in the world, 2,100 miles to the closest landmass, and only 1,300 miles to the closest inhabited island. So who were the Rapa Nui people and how did they get there? Well, we do know that they were of Polynesian descent, and they were colonizing explorers who got on their boats, planning to never come back, and going somewhere they've never been, not knowing how long it would take. And according to folklore, basing this whole trip on revelations from a dream. Would you get on that ship? What would you take with you? Everywhere the Polynesians went, they brought some combination of their staples: pigs, dogs, chickens, and rats, as well as palm saplings and other transportable plants. We know for sure that the first inhabitants to the island brought chickens with them, as we'll see later. The initial settlers flourished, gradually expanding their society and eventually constructing the iconic stone heads for which the island is renowned. How many have seen pictures of these statues? Would you be surprised to learn that the statues are actually of a whole body which has been buried over time? Or that the statues weren't really statues, but actually the physical, sacred embodiment of the ancestors? From here on out, I'll refer to them as moai. And I think it's important to consider what the moai were, what they meant to the people who carved them, how they carved them, and perhaps most important to understanding them, why. The fact that the most famous examples of moai are actually the broken and abandoned ones is illustrative of a common narrative about Rapa Nui. This version of history has itself been around for hundreds of years, and more recently been given a scholastic sheen by Jared Diamond in his book, Collapse: How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed. From the back of the book, on lonely Easter Island, humans ignored nature, built astonishing monuments to themselves, and guaranteed their own demise. According to this version, there was a moai mania that directly led to the deforestation of the island, loss of other natural resources, civil war, and cannibalism, aka ecocide. It plays out like Lorax, which with someone casually and carelessly cutting down the last tree and not considering or caring about the consequences, which granted is an important lesson for a society like ours, where we double and triple down on the manufacture of plastics at a time when microplastics have now been found in fetal tissue, breast milk, blood, and shit, air and water, literally all over the globe. So yes, in theory, I have to admit ecocide is plausible, but there are several problems with this version. Besides exhibiting lots of gross assumptions and having almost all of the aforementioned biases, this theory has been supplanted by new evidence and new kinds of evidence in the last 20 years. This version is also an insult to the islanders, the people from the past, and our shared humanity. One thing that is clear is that evidence shows the food intake of the islanders was in many ways better than that of Europeans at the same time in history. When the Europeans looked out at a vast rocky landscape, they did not understand that they were seeing was actually a technique known as rock mulching. These rock gardens are still operating as their creators intended hundreds of years later, as evidenced by higher concentration of minerals in the soil. In the same way, some historians have pointed to the existence of brutally sharp blades as evidence of warfare. However, when you consider that the weapons were found at agricultural sites and have evidence of vegetable matter, you have to ask, what's the difference between a weapon and a tool? There are some things that the evidence does not say. Sometimes the important part of a story is what's missing. The evidence for a thing is a lack of evidence. In the case of Rapa Nui, what's missing is large-scale evidence of inter-island conflict or tribal warfare. In an isolated island, the archaeological evidence tends to pile up. And the archaeological evidence of warfare and violence is often very clear. Skeletons without heads, skulls with arrowheads inside of them, bones with lance marks, defensive structures, all of which are missing from Rapa Nui. But something did happen. There was a collapse. The island was completely deforested. The islanders did burn wood for cremation fires. There's evidence of that. They also burned wood in their kitchen stoves. They also cut down trees for the same reason people in every other part of the world have done and continue to do, agriculture. But the most devastating blow to the forest likely occurred as a result of rats that came on boats with the chickens, whether intentional or not. The ancient extinct palm tree from Rapa Nui took 50 years to flower and germinate one seed. As soon as people and rats showed up, the tree's days were numbered. The rats ate the precious seeds and also ate the eggs of nesting birds, exacerbating the situation for the islanders. But instead of causing the collapse of the ecosystem, the Rapa Nui people actually met the challenge with a creative ingenuity that saved the culture. Then the aliens showed up. Of course, here I mean alien in the Latin root sense of the word, of or belonging to another, not one's own, foreign, strange. And I'm sorry if the title was in any way misleading. But let's imagine aliens from another world, which is perhaps the best way to imagine what it might have been like on that Easter Sunday. How would their sudden appearance affect us? What would first contact be like? The movie Mars Attacks give us an idea. First contact is approached with eagerness and trepidation by the humans, and is met with cultural misunderstandings, language barriers, and extreme violence with lasers. But the alien encounter for the people of Rapa Nui was real, just not with lasers. The Rapa Nui met the aliens with an extreme curiosity and extreme boldness. The sailors met the Rapa Nui with anxiety and fear. So would you be surprised to learn that it did involve cultural misunderstandings, language barriers, and the firing of weapons? There are a few written records from that Sunday. One comes from Cornelius Bowman. And while this kind of account is fascinating, it cannot be taken at face value. The encounter happened in phases over the course of a few days. At first, the sailors saw fires on the island, but couldn't approach because of weather. And as they were waiting, one of the Rapa Nui, likely that year's Birdman, which is another story, rowed his canoe out to meet the alien ship. This is from the captain's log. I was thinking about having somebody else read it so that you could tell it was a direct quote, but bear with me. Meanwhile, we noticed a small boat nearby in which an old naked man was sitting, who yelled loudly. I went to him in my sloop and brought him, notwithstanding much resistance, to the Orend. He was a man far in his 50s with a brown skin and a goatee in the Turkish manner, of a very strong build. He was greatly surprised by the construction of our ship and all its tackle, as we could understand from his gestures. As we could not understand him at all, we could only interpret his gestures and indications. We gave him a little mirror in which he looked, which frightened him awfully, just as the sounding of our bell did. We gave him a glass of gin, which he poured over his face, and when he felt its force, he began rubbing his eyes clean. Then we gave him a second glass with a biscuit, but he did not eat it. He must have been ashamed of his nakedness because he saw that we were all dressed. Therefore, he put his arms and head on the table. He seemed to be addressing his God, which we could clearly see from his movements when he raised his head and hands many times towards the sky, using many words in a loud voice. In this way, he was busy for half an hour, and when he stopped, he started jumping and singing. He showed himself very gay and joyful. We bound a small piece of sailcloth over his loins, which pleased him wonderfully. He had by nature a happy countenance. He danced together with the sailors when we let them play the violin for him. He was greatly surprised by the music and the construction of the instrument. His canoe had been made of small planks that were held together by some sort of rope. It had 2 blocks of wood on the inside. It was so light that one man alone could easily carry it. For us, it was surprising that one man alone had the courage to venture out so far in the ocean with nothing else at his disposal but one paddle. The next day, in compliance with this instruction, we sent some armed men to the shore. But when they approached the beach, there was such a multitude of natives that they did not dare to come any nearer or go ashore. They informed that the natives had not hesitated to go in the water and to try and steal the oars of our sloop. So they returned without having effected their purpose. They were not afraid of us, because they came in little boats and many swimming on bunches of reed, and they came on board without any arms at all. Our sailors who had been in our sloop near the beach also reported that they had seen no one with any weapon. Those who came in canoes, as well as those who came swimming on reeds, brought living and fried chickens and bananas, for which they asked nothing. They looked with great astonishment at our ship and its rigging, but they were great thieves who desired everything they saw, because many of them took worn-out brooms, small pieces of wood, spokes, firewood, and such stuff with them, jumped overboard and swam to the shore with them, which, in my opinion, they did more out of curiosity than to get an advantage from this, as those objects had absolutely no value at all. Towards evening, we made them swim to the shore or paddle as far as they had canoes because we had had enough of their company. In the meantime, the commander also arrived on the roads. Rosendahl and I went on board with him. He told us the next day we would decide to go ashore and visit the island with a big group of people. 134 men from the landing party from 3 ships. We came to shore without any resistance, except for those of us who had been instructed to stay in the sloops in order to guard them. The inhabitants had absolutely no weapons at all. They approached us in multitudes with their bare hands in order to welcome us, hopping and jumping for joy. Notwithstanding, 9 or 10 of them were shot dead and several wounded, which was the responsibility of my undercoxswain Cornelius Menz, who had fired without instruction. Others had concluded that such an order had been given and also fired. This caused great offense. He tried to excuse himself by presenting some invalid argument, such as the inhabitants had tried to fetch the barrel of his gun and had also threatened to throw stones, which was not believed by Master Roggeveen, Koster, Rosendahl, the lieutenant, the ensign, and me, neither by the other officers and many sailors, because we first came on land and had all passed through a great crowd of inhabitants who made room for us with every possible sign of great friendship. After the shooting, the inhabitants started fleeing inland in a great hurry, upon which we marched after them in formation up to their houses, in which we found nothing at all. We saw the inhabitants going further inland over the mountains, but we had no intention of following them because we saw nothing on this island of any value. And then just like that, they left, leaving behind unknown diseases that would have been devastating on such a remote island. And after a few decades of recovery, another ship showed up with a different set of bugs and viruses. The alien encounters continued with increasing regularity. In 1789, it was literally put on the map. Captain Cook himself showed up and with a group of soldiers searched the whole island until they found one of the most detailed and rare of the moai and took it back as a gift to a queen who put it in a museum where it still is to this day. Things continued to get worse until 1805 when the Americans showed up, and then things started to get much worse. An American whaling ship stopping to take on fresh water, and really I want to stop, that ship was only that far south because of the over-whaling that had been going on closer to their home ports. So stopping to take on fresh water, they took on 9 slaves to fill out their crew. They were chained in the galley, and the moment they were unchained and led onto the main deck, all of them instantly jumped into the ocean. The slave raids continued for the next 70 years until they culminated in one final raid that took more than half of the remaining islanders. Eventually, there was an effort by some to repatriate the Rapa Nui. More than half of them died on the voyage home. The survivors brought smallpox with them. In the end, there were 120 people. The people living on Rapa Nui are descended from a group of 35 people. The remaining islanders were forced to live in the last remaining settlement on the island. They had to build a wall around it, likely with ancient stones from old platforms and rock gardens. The rest of the island was turned into a sheep ranch, and there are photographs of sheep literally stripping the bark off of some of the last few remaining trees, leaving the grassy plains that can be seen in pictures today. The islanders were allowed to go past the wall to work for the ranchers, but not for money, only for script that could be spent at the company store. One of the Rapa Nui who did not survive the voyage home was the last priest of an ancient culture who alone in the world was able to read a very rare and unique, independently invented written language called Rongo Rongo. The glyphs of the Rongo-Rongo language are indeed one of the true unsolved mysteries of Rapa Nui. However, there is one mystery of Rapa Nui that in my opinion has been solved, and that is the mystery of how the Moai were moved. Imagine it like a puzzle. Your goal is to move a sacred object about 20 miles from the quarry to the platform. It's as big as a bus, but weighs as much as a jumbo jet. You can use whatever you find on the island, but you haven't invented the wheel. How would you do it? I'll give you a hint. They did not use trees as rollers. And after the Moai in place, they put white and red eyes on them. Any ideas? If we could ask the ancestors how they got there, and if we could hear them say, they would say, "We walked." This was also an answer given by islanders to those who even bothered to ask. Eventually, a Rapa Nui resident became an archaeologist and was able to show how it was done. The key was in examining the pattern of the fallen Moai, which wasn't a pattern at all unless the Moai were moved upright. So, Greg, I think we'll turn the projector on at this point because it's really easier to see than for me to explain. But this is a proof of concept. So like I said, one of the keys was in finding out that they put eyes on the statues later, which led them to hypothesize what if, because they also know that the faces of them were carved in more detail after they were put in place. So they started to work with the idea that there was a difference between a statue that was being moved that was finally finished in its place. So you guys see the statue on the screen?
Yes.
Here he is walking, just like they said the whole time. Without any trees, with only a small group of people.
So I said I couldn't walk.
There it is, boom, ancient mystery solved.
One step at a time.
Sometimes the answer to the greatest mystery was in front of you the whole time. And the key is not so much new technology, but a new way of looking. Fresh eyes, a different perspective, a change in your awareness, an outlook that reveals the meaning of the answer you already knew, like the face of the ancestors slowly revealing themselves through the rock. I don't know if there's time for questions or not, if anybody has any.
That was fascinating. Yeah. Wonderful.
Does anybody have a question for Mike?
I watched the program pre this explanation, and they figured it was depopulated because there were tribes that were fighting and killing each other, and that's how they disappeared.
Well,
That is not proven right anymore.
so there is some evidence that suggests, of course, there were conflicts, but it's not a lot of evidence. And when they talk about extreme conflicts, that evidence is missing. So for me, when I look at the evidence and they say this is an example of tribal warfare or inner conflict, Some of that evidence can also be explained away and has a less nefarious explanation. One thing specifically about this island was it was not monolithic in the sense that there were different groups of people, different family groups, and the island, if you could think of like a circle, cut like a pizza, so that you have a tract of land that goes from the coast to the middle, and everybody has a little bit of coastal land and everybody has a little bit of forest. But if you want to go from one part of the island to another, you have to be at least friendly enough with all the other people on the island. So they had kind of a unique political, cultural structure as well that kind of goes against the idea of the fighting, which some of the evidence for fighting is folkloric in the sense that it's coming from memories and stories. And there's an idea that some of the stories that talk about the most extreme conflict are conflating dates of things that happened after slave raids. So,
How big is East Carolina?
about 60 miles
60 square miles?
ish.
And the population got down to what?
The last slave raids, like that part of it, there was about 120 people on the island, and only 35 of them had children. Although there were some of the Rapa Nui who weren't living on the island at that time.
So we're talking about genocide.
Yeah.
Have the numbers come back?
That I'm not sure. That I think so. I can't really be sure of that. They do. Obviously, they're still alive. Those people are still there, and they're still dealing with the struggles that go along with that experience. Some of it is like tourists can bring money, but can bring problems. That kind of a thing.
Can you get to it by boat?
You have to pretty much take an airplane.
Well, they got an air?
Yeah, and actually, you used to have to take an airplane and a boat, and the airport was not very good. But sometime in the 80s, the United States generously loaned the money for them to build a bigger airport, just in case we need to ever land an emergency space shuttle there. So that's why they have an airport.
Speaking of aliens, right?
A recent program we watched, they looked at the DNA. There was supposition, like from the Kon-Tiki, that the people were populated from Chileans, people who lived in Chile. But they found in the DNA it was all Polynesian.
So the DNA evidence, especially going back to the earliest settlements of the island, and compared with cultural evidence, they're Polynesian people. Some of the idea that they weren't Polynesian came from older misunderstandings about the Polynesians' ability to sail, especially against the current in the Pacific. Like, you don't accidentally go that far in the wrong direction. But they've also, Kon-Tiki proved proof of concept that somebody from, I think, Peru or Chile could get on a boat and make it to Rapa Nui as well. So the DNA evidence of later people shows that there was either somebody from South America came here, or somebody from here came there and went back. But at some point, those two people met as well. And the evidence of the sweet potato itself is more directly reflecting that cross-cultural, because the South Americans had the sweet potato, and so did the Rapa Nui. At some point, they got it from over there, and that's the only place they could have got it.
Well, also the Rapa Nui got to that island,
Yeah.
so they knew how to sail.
So one of the things that came up was like the old guy in his canoe with only a paddle. And this is one of the things that I think is really fascinating, is that when their ships were in ocean, like open ocean storms, they would actually sink them, maybe 75, 80%, so that most of the ship is under the waves and they can just ride it out instead of getting knocked over. and then when it's done, bail out and keep going. So it was a kind of sailing that allowed them to do that the Europeans had no concept of.
Wow.
And also navigating with stars and the seabirds, that they can follow the migration paths. The island itself and some of the islets around it are home to nesting birds that play prominently in their folklore about, if you follow these birds, you'll go home. And there's songs about that. But it's also probably literally true if you see those birds migrating to where. So that was part of the reason how they figured that they could get there, that if they could use the birds, that island actually becomes about 200-mile strip in the ocean that they could navigate towards if they know how to read birds.
So do you know when they first came to the island?
That is one of the hotly debated topics that it used to be thought that it was like 600 AD when they first started, but which kind of gives more room to a bigger rise and fall in population. But more newer evidence that's more direct and creative, I would say, in the way that it can draw conclusions. They're saying now it's more likely that it was around 1200 AD instead of 6.
So before or after they colonized Hawaii?
It must have been after because of where it is on the triangle. So yeah, after Hawaii.
Any other questions? Comments? Thank you very much, Mike.
I'm gonna have to have a bite this week.
Okay, the closing song is number 18, What Wondrous Love. Please stand as you're willing and able. Are there any announcements?
We served Miss Andrea when we're singing.
Yes.